All right, welcome back, everyone. So this is going to be our next topic here as we're covering our Greek world. And for anybody else who just wants kind of a nice overview history of ancient Sparta, this should hopefully provide you a lot of good information. It's probably going to be a little longer than some of the other lectures. I think I'm just going to put it all into one lecture here and just kind of go through the whole story of Sparta. I have a funny little short I do on like the 5 most interesting things about Sparta. This is going to be a little bit more detailed than that. So hopefully if anybody's looking for more information, this is going to be very helpful for you. So what's the deal with Sparta? There's a lot of civilizations, and for those of you in my History 110 class, what we've been talking about is comparing Athens and Sparta, right? And as we talk about Sparta this lecture, I'm going to make some more comparisons to Athens as well from that we talked about in the previous lectures. And yes, they had a few things and similarities that I've kind of covered in my other lecture there, but what we're looking at here primarily is the differences between these two mighty city-states. And Sparta is really this unique civilization. And when I say unique, one of my little pet peeves is nothing can ever be very unique. Unique means there's only one of it, there's nothing else. And there's really nothing else like the Spartans. There are civilizations that share some similarities to the Spartans, but nobody that shares all the things that we think of with ancient Sparta. So we're going to go through a few things here, and at the end, I'm also going to mention a couple other quick little things about some other Greek city-states, just so I want you to know. But these are all things, obviously, you're gonna need to know for your quiz and your midterm and so forth, right? And for just anybody else who's listening who's just curious about Sparta a bit. So the first thing is just some basic attributes of Spartan society I want you to know, and just a map, of course. We always like our maps. So in terms of where Sparta is located, you can see they're down here, so further south, and sometimes what we call the Peloponnese area. And so, in terms of basic characteristics and basic attributes of the Spartans, they are a large city state, right? And I think that's the first thing I want you to know. They do have a lot of people there. Now, how many people they have, we're not exactly sure. There's this kind of theoretical number that at any given time there are 9,000 Spartan citizens. So it's kind of this number that they always had. How many people lived in Sparta is a little bit harder to gauge, and I'll explain why that is as we go on in our next slide after I talk about a few things. But 9,000 Spartan citizens, in other words, male, adults, able to fight, as you're going to see, all of that. Sparta is a little bit more slower to act than Athens. Athens, if you remember, we said kind of jumps into things pretty quickly. They're very outgoing. It's not that Sparta is completely isolated, doesn't get involved in anything, but we'll see in some wars that we'll talk about later. Athens is definitely a little bit more eager than Sparta is to get involved in things. Another thing about the Spartans, well, is that they are Spartan. Just that adjective Spartan, when we think of that, it's a great word if you're reading novels. You'll see that a lot. You walk into a Spartan room. Well, what does that mean? It means that, it's very basic, doesn't have a lot of things in it. Another word is, you can see up here, autokria, basically meaning self-sufficient. This idea of being as an individual strong and able to be able to take care of yourself and all of that. Those are things that we associate with the Spartans as well. So these are some of the things that are a bit slower to act. They don't change as much. If you look at their governments, I don't think it's quite as in flux as the government of Athens, as we lectured on in Athens. It goes to an oligarchy and a democracy, and then eventually joins back again. So Sparta has a little bit less dramatic changes in it. So those are a few basic attributes of Sparta that I want you to know, and you can already start to see how they're a little bit different than Athens. One of the core things that I always like talking about is how they raise their children. And this is a topic that is very well known for people who know Spartan history. But for my students, you really do want to know these characteristics. And the thing is, if you compare them to Athens, right? In Athens, if you're born in Athens, you're a child, you're going to be raised by your parents, you're going to learn some sort of trade at some point in your life, and you do whatever trade you have. In Sparta, if you're born into one of these male citizen families, you are born, the first 6 years of your life or so, you're going to be raised by your mom. When you're about 7 years of age, you're then taken and you're put in military school. And basically from about the ages of 7 to 18, you're going to be in this military training. Remember, I think I gave you the term before, hoplite, in one of the other previous lectures. Hoplite is a Greek soldier, and the best Greek soldiers were, of course, the Spartans, because they were trained to fight from the time they were 7 years old. And a few things about their training. So all these things, of course, you want to know. It's not enough for your exams, for the people taking this or watching this for my class, for the exams, just to say, well, they raise their kids to be military. Give examples, talk about it. And so, for example, one of the things we know about the Spartans is they would teach them how to fight, and they would teach them never to surrender. One of the most famous stories of the Spartans in your textbooks as well talks about a Spartan mom talking to her child, and an adult child is off to go to war. And the Spartan mom goes to the child and says, well, you're off to a great war. You better come back victorious, or you better come back dead being carried on your hoplon shield. And imagine that from a mom today whose son is about to go off to war. You don't think most moms would say that, but it was really part of Spartan society. So they were trained militarily, they were trained how to fight and techniques, but they were also told, you never retreat in battle. And they were taught how to be very tough, right? You would walk barefoot. You would wear maybe one article of clothing all year. These are all characteristics that they would go through. I said they would go training from the time they were like 7 to 18, but they did kind of separate them, and from like the age of 7 to 12, and then age 12 to 18, they'd kind of go into another school with older kids. And very often they would go through these really interesting rites of passages and these competitions. You have this word agon, Greek word competition, and from that it's agony. And when you look at the rites of passages of these Spartans, it was things like, go and kill a slave without being caught, or how long can you be whipped without, breaking? And these are things that they would go through in order to show their strength. And so these are all examples of, again, when they raised kids, it was brutal when they raised them. Another element, another attribute of the Spartans in terms of raising their children that I want you to know is even their babies. It was said they would bathe their babies with wine instead of water, because they believed that they bathed their babies with wine, it would make them stronger, build up their skin, make them tougher, build up their constitution. I don't know if that's true, if you just get a whole bunch of drunk babies, but it is something apparently the Spartans did. And of course, another characteristic of how they raised their children: what if you were a Spartan male and you were born with a birth defect? Well, we know what they did. They practiced infanticide. The Spartans would have these children put out to what is called exposure. And they would put them out in the wilderness, and if they were judged unfit, that's it. They would die. So very often, in a lot of movies, people glorify the Spartans, and they go, oh, what a wonderful group of people, how amazing of them. Remember, these are people who killed their own children, their own infants, if they were deemed unfit and not strong enough. And the argument is, well, if you're not strong enough to do this, then you won't survive the training and you won't survive your role. Because what ends up happening is when you're 18, you're done, and if you're a Spartan male citizen, your job is to fight. You're a soldier, you're a hoplite, and that's it. And that's why when you do think of Spartan history, Greek history, and you think of the infantries, the Spartans were the strongest infantry forces in the Greek world. And of course, this is going to matter later on when we talk about some of the wars and battles in upcoming lectures. So those are a few things just on the Spartans in terms of how they raised their children, and you can see it's very different than if you were in Athens. Now again, all of this is for the boys. That's how the boys were raised. So another interesting question, of course, is what about the Spartan women? And so I want to talk about the Spartan women in the next slide here, and a couple other elements, or a few other elements of Spartan society. So let's move on. And here, what is it about women in Athens versus the women in Sparta? So one of the things that I tell my students, or I ask my students in class, when I do this in class, I ask the students, well, where would you rather live if you're a woman? Would you rather live in Athens, or would you rather live in Sparta? And, some students say Athens, some say Sparta, but at the end of the day, where would you have more rights? And the answer would be Sparta. So again, if you're working on this, and this is an essay or an ID, it's not enough just to say, well, in Athens, women had less rights than Sparta. You're going to want to give examples. So let me give you some examples you can note down, right? So you should be always jotting all these things. You got the key words, but you're also jotting the important points I say about them. So, for example, in Athens, women were not allowed to inherit property or own property. In Sparta, women were allowed to own property. In fact, they owned quite a bit of property. I've seen different numbers on this, maybe 20, 30, 40% of the property was owned by Spartan women. So they actually owned women and they were allowed to inherit land, something you don't see in Athens. Another interesting difference between women in Athens and Sparta is women in Sparta were encouraged to be tough and strong and healthy, much more so than women in Athens were. So women in Sparta were encouraged to be stronger. Women in Sparta tended to probably get married a little bit later. I've read some accounts of that. And you say, well, why does that matter? Well, if you're in Athens and you're getting married when you're 14 and you're having kids when you're 14, 15, childbirth was very difficult at that age, and maybe many more women in Athens passed away from childbirth, whereas Sparta, women may have been stronger and healthier. So I've kind of read ideas about that. Women were not allowed to engage in financial transactions in Athens, any major financial transaction. And in Sparta, women were allowed to engage in financial transactions. So in several ways, women actually had more rights in Sparta than Athens. And there's a reason for that, of course. And we see this in other cultures. This is not unique to ancient Sparta. And what we see in Athens, in Sparta, is because the men are so involved in military and fighting all the time, someone's got to be running the businesses and the shops and whatever it needs to be done. And very often that would fall on the women because the men's job was to fight. And I say that's not unique because you see this, for example, in World War I. You see this in some other cultures as well, and other times in history where women's roles are elevated because men are all off fighting. So that's a pretty interesting difference there between Athens and Sparta. The next thing I want to talk about when we talk about Athens and Sparta, and specifically in Sparta, is slaves. Now, Athens did have slaves, but in Sparta, the slave situation was a whole lot different because the slaves in Sparta were called helots. So a Spartan slave is a helot. Sometimes students confuse this with hoplite. Hoplite is a Greek soldier. Helot is a Spartan slave. And I'm not going to get into all the details of where they got them from. It's from an earlier war, we believe, against people called Messenians. It's okay if you don't know that. But what you do want to know is there were a lot of them. How many? That's hard to gauge, right? Because they were slaves. And this is why it's hard to tell how many people lived in Sparta. But maybe it was 10 to 1, maybe it was 7 to 1, maybe it was 12 to 1, 15 to 1. For every one Spartan citizen, in other words, there may have been 7, 8, 9, 10 slaves. So one question that often comes up is if there were that many of them, why didn't the Spartan slaves just revolt? And the answer is they probably couldn't because they didn't have weapons, right? All the weapons are in the hands of the Spartans. So the Spartan hoplites, and they're not trained to fight. They're not. They also are very often kind of mentally put down, and there's this kind of physical and psychological control against the helots. And so I tell students, well, imagine having today one American trained Navy SEAL, right? And he's got weapons. And then you take 10 average Americans, and I'm going to teach on the third floor of the building, and my students like huff and puff climbing up the third story to the third floor, and I go, take 10 average Americans or huff and puff climbing up the third story of a building, and they're already out of breath, and then you put those in a room together. My money is going to be on that American Navy SEAL, especially if he's got the weapon and the other ones don't. And so it is something that the Spartans were able to do for a very long time, is maintain a large slave population. So this is something that they have a lot more of than Athens did. Okay, so you definitely want to know that. The next term there is oligarchy. And the oligarchy, of course, has to do with the Spartan government. So when I lectured on Athens, I gave you quite a bit of detail of Athenian government, right? We talked about, Draco and Solon and Cleisthenes, and I gave you a bunch of details on that. So you're going to want to know that, if you're comparing Athens and Sparta, for example, in an essay, you'd probably spend more time talking about the Athenian government than the Spartan government, but you'd probably spend more time writing about how Spartans raised their children than how Athens raised their children. So just kind of keep that in mind. And so With them, it's an oligarchy, which again really means rule of a few. And really, we just have a few things I want you to know about this. They had monarchs. They had two kings, actually, at any given time. So they had two kings. And at the same time, they also had what we call five ephors, or overseers. And these five ephors and two kings, they were the ones who essentially decided what to do in Sparta. I've read different accounts again, who has more influence, the kings or the ephors. So there's again, if you study just Greek history and you take a whole course on Greek history, you'd go into a lot more detail on all this. And I'm not going to go into all that detail here for you guys. But as long as you know, there were two kings, five ephors. These seven individuals made the key decisions on what to do in Sparta. There was also a group they called the Gerousia, and the Gerousia was a group of 28. And the Gerousia is kind of a group of elders generally who were kind of the cabinet, the advisors to the Spartan kings, and they would kind of give them advice on what to do, and they could kind of influence some events as well. But that's essentially all I really want you to know about the government of Sparta, right? So it's just an oligarchy, two kings, five ephors, and that Gerousia. Okay. The next characteristic about the Spartans that I want to talk about are the writers and the thinkers. Now, once I'm done lecturing on the Greeks, and I go through the Greek geography a little bit, and we talk about the Greek political, and talked about Athens and Sparta, and the next lectures are going to be about the wars. I always like talking about Greek writers, and you're all going to get a lecture about some of the Greek writers and thinkers and scientists and so forth. And one thing, when we compare Athens and Sparta, there are a lot from Athens, right? For all of you in my course, for example, you should probably be reading the play Antigone, which is in your reader. And of course, that's a play by Sophocles, an Athenian writer. And there are many other Athenian writers, and there are writers from other Greek cities-state as well. But there are a lot from Athens you're going to see. What about Sparta? Well, not many. And in fact, you have this one name here, Teratius, who apparently wrote mainly military poetry. Are there others? Yeah, there are some other Spartan writers, but they're not well known. It's not their thing. And I do think it's very fair to say, when you compare Athens and Sparta, that you want to know this one name, but at the end of the day, there were many, many, many more Athenian writers than there were Spartan writers, because for them, it wasn't their thing, right? Their thing was fighting and being strong hoplites and all of that good stuff. All right, so those are some of the key characteristics, and you kind of compare them back and forth. And by the way, in your modules, I put a funny little video from this site called Horrible Histories. It's kind of, you can watch, it's just a few minutes, but it's kind of funny. It compares women in Athens and Sparta, and they do it in a funny way. So you can watch that as well. All right. So we have Athens, and those are some of the core characteristics of Sparta. Again, there's a little bit more to all of this. There's more to their details, into their fighting and their kids and everything. But if you know all that, you've got a lot of good information to work with. Now, we're not done with Sparta. Again, all of this is what I've been describing to you is basically, again, just like with Athens, primarily between the years about 800 and 500 BC. During that same time period, there are other Greek city-states, right? And so I do want you to know about a few other Greek city-states. Just real quickly, I'm going to point them out where they are on the map and why they're interesting and what I want you to know about them. And then from there, we'll kind of move on. So let's go ahead and just kind of talk about a couple other Greek city-states here in our next map and go from there. All right, so these are some of the other Greek city-states I want you to know about. And I'm going to go through a lot of detail, just kind of mainly know where they are. And so if you look at them over here, we've got Thebes, right? So Thebes is located right over here. I kind of circle it a bit. Sorry, I just kind of missed it a little bit. So Thebes, let me try again here so you can see a little better. Let me actually highlight it. It'll be a little easier to see, I think. Yeah, okay. So here's Thebes. It's kind of north of Athens. And Thebes is an interesting city-state because I kind of like to describe Thebes as kind of Athens' little sister in some ways, where they share some of the characteristics of Athens, but they're a little bit smaller. And for a long time, they kind of second fiddle. But later on, we'll talk about Thebes again. They're going to be pretty important. Another city-state, one that I've been to actually, is Corinth. Now, Corinth is important because of its location between the Gulf of Corinth, the Saronic Gulf. You don't need to know those terms, but you definitely want to know Corinth. And you could see it's between Sparta and Athens. And why is it important where they're located? It's the geography, very important for trade. If you want to trade through the Greek world from the north to the south, you got to go through Corinth. If you want to trade eventually by sea, you can go all the way around, or you can go through and cut through Corinth. I read one account once that, you go, well, how do you get across the land? And so sometimes people would sail across, get to Corinth, pick up their boat, carry it across the other side, drop it, and keep going because it was still faster than sailing across. Now, something that would be very smart to have in Corinth is a canal. There will eventually be a canal built there, but that's going to be done by the Romans a little bit later. The other thing about Corinth is they're a very important trading city and very often were rivals of Athens. Athens and Sparta were often rivals, of course, because they're the two big city-states. So as a result of that, because Athens and Sparta were rivals and Corinth and Athens were rivals, very often Corinth and Sparta ended up being allies. So that's something we're going to see a little bit on in future lectures as well. All right, what else can I tell you about these other city-states? We have Naxos here. Naxos is just one of these islands. I'm going to talk about it in another lecture moving forward. Remember, all of these islands are going to be city-states. Miletus, this is one of the city-states on Asia Minor or Ionia. Definitely want to know that term, Ionia. So the coast of Asia Minor is Ionia or Anatolia. And so there you had some Greek city-state as well, and Miletus is one of them. Again, it's another one I'm going to talk about in future lectures for us, so you definitely want to know about that as well. So those are just some of the other Greek city-states. I've got a few pictures here I could show you of Corinth here, but definitely you want to know all of those, all right? So let me show you some pictures of Corinth. All right, so this is just a temple you have in Corinth. You have this temple to Apollo, so that's one kind of cool thing they have there. So that's one. Another thing I want to show you here is the agora at Corinth. So this is kind of cool. And if you recognize architecture, one of the cool things you can also see here is the arch here, which is actually Roman. So it shows us that the Romans are going to be there. So we have the agora at Corinth. And this is the canal. So this is going to be a canal that's going to be built later on. This is going to actually be built later by the Romans. And obviously it doesn't look really big. There's a big old modern canal today they have there, but you have that as a canal there. So those are a couple things there. And so you have those other city-states, just kind of be familiar where they are, and then you have the canal there. All right, so now where are we? So this is the next thing we're going to talk about. So we've been covering a few things about the Greeks. We talked about Greek geography. We talked about Athens, kind of comparing Athens and Sparta a little bit. What we have now to look at is what's next. And if you remember in the previous lectures, we had talked about Persia. If you remember this map up here in the top right over here, right, we can see this map. This was everything in green, remember, was the Persian Empire around the year 500 BC. And everything on this other map is, of course, this Greek world around 500 BC. And what you see, if you pay close attention, is right along the coast of Asia Minor in Ionia, they overlap. And of course, that overlap is vital because what that means is by 500 BC, these two cultures are going to clash. And as they clash, this is going to help bring about one of the most epic wars in all of Greek history, what we call the Persian War. So that's going to be a fun lecture we're going to talk about. It's one of those lectures I tell my students, especially, this is definitely one I prefer to do in person than online. But still, even online, I think it's pretty fun to talk about in these video lectures. But it's, I tell my students, it's like a story you could tell by a campfire every night and never get bored with it. So it's this amazing tale of the battle between the Persians and the Greeks and how it all unfolds and how close, really, in a couple of instances, the Greek world was almost gone. And it's one of those great what ifs. What if this whole war went very differently than what it did? So anyways, that's going to be our next topics, talking about the wars, first between the Persians and the Greeks, and then wars between the Greeks and the Greeks. And so those are going to be kind of what we're moving to next in our next series of lectures here. All right, so I hope all that's clear. You got all that good information on Sparta and their characteristics. If you have any questions, let me know. And that's pretty much all I got for you. And then the next lectures will be on those wars. All right, everyone. Thank you. Have a good day.